Why not consider becoming a supporter of Film Network Ireland on buymeacoffee.com/FNI and sign up to become a member so you can benefit from all sorts of little extra perks. Tickets for screenings, tickets to our meetups, discounts, and so much more. You'll find more about us on social media, on Facebook and Insta on @Film Network Ireland. As always, we are excited to bring you exclusive interviews with some of Ireland's top filmmakers, actors, and industry insiders. If you enjoy our show, why not deep dive into our back catalogue for a varied and exciting look behind the scenes of what it's actually like to work in the film and TV industry across all departments on the island of Ireland. WRAPCHAT is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you find your audio content relating to film and TV.
Hello, I'm Joe Griffin and welcome to the latest FNI WRAPCHAT. We had the great pleasure of talking to Donncha Gilmore, writer-director of Girls and Boys, which won Best Independent Irish Film at the Galway Film Festival. It's a really lovely film and we had a good time talking about that movie and about getting it off the ground. So Donncha, I'm just going to dive right in, so much to talk about. The first thing that struck me about this film was Halloween. It's so cinematic, and Halloween in Dublin has a very distinctive flavour, just like Halloween in any other city would. Was it always intended to be shot at that time?
Always, yeah. I love Halloween and the visual possibilities like it could bring. I always loved it when I was young, and when I was a child, I was in like child acting, drama, and I did a few short films and ads when I was like, 9, 10, 11, 12. And one of them was a short film that was like a take on Hansel and Gretel that was shot at Halloween. And on Halloween night, we like did a final shot for this film, and it was in the Sally Gap. And I think the shooting of this film, seeing how films were made, like behind the camera, and it being done on Halloween, it must have inspired something in me or instilled something in me then. Because after being an actor as a child, I wanted to move more towards, writing and directing, and it seemed very fitting then. Like 20 years later, my first film, feature film, is set at Halloween.
And you're a horror fan, obviously, because you've dabbled in it as well.
I'm a big horror fan, and I think there's a lot of elements of like that love of horror in the film. Like there's no. The film isn't that horror at all, right? But the characters talk about it at some point, and there's like references to some horror films. And I think what happened really was I spent a large amount of my 20s, like many filmmakers, making shorts. And I really liked horror films. And, horror shorts seemed like a good way in, this type of, the path of like, you're going to make some short films and then you can work your way up to get a financed feature. And when I wanted to write a film that I could write and direct and produce independently with my brother, who's my producer, the horror scripts, I felt while I was working on them, I've kind of seen this before. And I think if you're going to do something like self-finance a feature film, you have to really love it and believe in it, because you're putting your money on the line. There's a lot at stake, and I didn't want to write something and think, this could be a film. This could be a good film. I had to write something that was like, now I really want this to be made. I need it to be made. And I think what Girls and Boys came from was that I had this story in mind for nearly 15 years. I think I first came up with the premise when I was in college myself. And the idea wouldn't go away. It kept coming back to me over years. I would try and write it, and I couldn't get past the first act. For years, it just didn't, work. And I think what happened was I realized that I'd met these characters at the wrong time in their life, because the film was set at secondary school, sixth year for years. And then when I updated the setting to college, they're in like third year, it all clicked into place. So that's why I didn't make like a horror feature film, because I just felt, I would see stuff like Damien McCarthy's Oddity and Caveat, which he did the same thing as me. He self-financed Caveat. I thought that film had a real point of view. Like, I thought his style was in there. He did a really good job. And the same with Oddity. And I think that's what you need with like independent filmmaking. You need to have something that's a strong point of view and unique. And so, because I didn't feel I had it with the horror scripts, this is why I went in a different direction.
That makes sense. The ideal films for me personally, I don't know if you share the view, are ones that have something strong to say and have the audience in mind. I thought with this one, it was a good time, a good value film, like money well spent and time well spent at the movies, while also having something to say. Was it always a conscious decision to give the audience a good time, to try not and get too didactic, while also not being too frivolous, striking the balance?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the issue film, so to speak, because, I think people can smell that from a mile away, this idea of like, someone is here to teach me a lesson, basically. And as that famous quote goes from Claire Denis at a press conference, she's like, I'm a filmmaker, not a social worker, when someone asked her about responsibility in film. And I think that the film does have a lot to say about, certain issues regards like sex and gender. But I was very conscious about the medium itself as well, and how I wanted it to be, somewhat playful, and at times there's levity, and then there's like stylistic elements, like with the Super 8 film sequences that come into play. Because, I think that's the most effective way to address these kinds of issues. I was a big fan of the work of Janet Green, who's a screenwriter, an English screenwriter in the 20th century, and she worked with Basil Dearden. She made these films, these kind of social issue, like genre films. She made one called Sapphire with him, and one called Victim. And in particular, Victim, which is about a lawyer who's a closeted gay man who is the target of a sting operation. It's playing with this idea, addressing the idea of being a gay man in the 1950s and how it can be used against your social status. But it's also like a thriller genre piece, and they're really cool films. So I think that you can talk about these kind of issues in films, but also make something that's engaging and entertaining and not too, self-serious, basically.
Yeah, I saw an interview a couple of years ago with Jane Fonda, and she said that she tries as much as possible to make issues movies, but they're always entertaining. So 9 to 5 is about sexism and women's place in the workplace and stuff, but it's still like a broad, fast-paced comedy, and things like the China Syndrome, and which is about nuclear safety, and then Coming Home, which is about how veterans are treated, but was also kind of a sexy love story. And so there's always ways to Trojan horse in social issues into your entertaining films.
Mm-hmm. I think people they're interested in the issues as well, but they just don't want, a lesson.
Yeah, or a lecture.
A lecture, yeah.
Let's talk about the look of the film. It looks lovely. I'm a big fan of neon and cities in films, and while this is obviously a very different film from something like Blade Runner or Atomic Blonde, those are films that love nighttime and love neon and love unnatural light, and you make great use of it with street lights and the rickshaw. Actually, lovely lighting in that. People are framed by the artificial chintzy lights in that. So, like, one was always a decision to try and use the city's artificial lights to augment the film, and two was was the fact that it was shot at night always going to a conscious decision?
Yeah, it's a real shame when you write a script and you're like, there's so many night scenes in this, and I have to go out at night. So that's why we shot it at January, which gives you the most night, but it's also very cold. So it was a very cold shoot, but it gets true dark at around 4:30 in January. So you're like, you got more hours. So myself and my cinematographer, Fionnuala McCormick, we talked a lot about that use of real natural light that you find in a city, and then you augment it slightly with some practicals, some things you can bring as well, because you don't want to basically fake a light in a city scene at night that isn't there, right? And we would go to these places on our recce's and be like, and just do these tests, like the scene in the boat, which has the bridge, which is all lit up with a really good animation. I was lucky on the Liffey, the Samuel Beckett Bridge, I think. Mm-hmm. Like there are places in Dublin that have very really good night lighting, and you just have to go out and find them, and test that at these places and see how they feel for the characters in that moment, and also how they look. Like, are you actually going to have enough light to shoot a scene there without bringing too much of your own, equipment in? Because you can kind of tell when someone does that, when it looks as if someone's just blown up a scene with a big, HMI. So that's why we attempted as much to do, in camera kind of lighting that was available, like your street lamps when we're outside, or the rickshaw you mentioned. That was a fun thing because I live in North City Dublin, and particularly around like concert times, you just see all these rickshaws zipping up and down. They ferry people from the point to different places, and some of them, they kind of do go all out and they put up cool like decorations on their rickshaw to stand out. And I also think that's a very Dublin thing, like the rickshaw. So that's one reason I wanted to like bring it in to the film. And it also gave me an excuse to bring in Joe McGuckin, who's great, as the rickshaw driver, to bring some levity into it.
Yeah, he was great comic relief.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, actually, just want to stay on Dublin for a minute because it's a city of much debate, and like I live in Dublin and from Dublin, and we go to my family go to the city centre the weekends a lot, and there's a lot of talk about how it's a dangerous city and it's like not friendly, and people complaining that it's disimproved and stuff. So, one, did you bring a perspective of your own to Dublin to this, and then secondly, did making the film impact your view of Dublin?
Yeah, my brother and I talked about this a lot in prep, about Dublin on film or Dublin on TV. It has a reputation, I would say. People are always joking about Dublin, and you do that when you're from a city anyway, but people will be like, Dublin is kip, Dublin's ugly, things like that, And I think any city is ugly if you frame it a certain way, or any city is beautiful if you frame it another way. And at the end of the day, Dublin is a European city where young people go out, party, drink, and fall in love and enjoy, the city. So why don't we have the visuals of Dublin mirror these characters in the film? So, like, yes, it has this reputation, I agree, but, like, there's oftentimes when people go to a city, like, they'll go to Paris after hearing about it for so long, and then they go for the first time, and they're like, this is not what I thought it was going to be. Like, because Paris, they give it that treatment in France on film. They beautify it, and they want it to look great, Whereas in Dublin, I suppose because we've also done a lot of crime thrillers, it kind of makes sense to embrace the grittier aspects of it if you're making something like a love-hate. Like, Dublin can also lend itself to that. But I feel like every city kind of is a canvas for the filmmaker. So you can make it look however you want, really, if you go out and just frame your shots in a specific way, There was a funny thing I saw once of Wes Anderson framing up shots, and you'd see the frame, and then you'd see outside the frame, and it just everything around it is horrible. Like, he might be shooting in a very kind of grim location in Budapest, but he's framed a very nice frame for the film. So, like, it's a similar thing with this. It's like Dublin has great parts to it that we wanted to showcase in this film.
Yeah, like if you look at Dublin in a photography exhibition of the rundown parts of it, that's one Dublin, and then there's the Dublin you see in like Gen Z's tourism Instagram or TikTok videos, and it looks like a completely different city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
When we talk about the casting, the casting is such a huge part of obviously any film, but especially this one because it was so intimate and it's almost like a two-hander. So it must have been hard to find the right actors.
Yeah, so when my brother and I decided to produce this film, I had a conversation with him where I said, we're going to make this film if we find the two leads that work together. Like, we can't just say we're going to make it regardless, because if the film doesn't have the chemistry between these two actors, then the film has nothing. It relied a lot on them. So that's why we had a fairly lengthy casting process. Now, I was lucky that I found Leah actually very early. So Leah Hannon, who plays Charlie, was just finishing up at Bow Street, and I obviously wanted to cast someone who was trans in the role, and she's like a great up-and-coming actress. Like, without Leah, there was no film, basically, is how I look at it. But once she came on board, it was actually much harder to find the Jason, the actor for that, because we would have to do chemistry reads. Like, it had to be in person, They'd have to come in and read with Leah and do a number of scenes that I would film and we would watch back, because I had to be sure going into this production that they had that chemistry together. I didn't want to find myself on a set and it wasn't working. So I think about 8 months later is when I found Adam Lunnan Collery, who plays Jason, and he came in to do 2 chemistry reads with Leah. And Leah was able to tell me as well, like, oh, well, that felt much better than anything else, like straight away. And I was like, yeah, I felt that too. But we brought him in again to be sure. And it's an ephemeral thing, chemistry between actors. It's not something that's that quantifiable, but it's something that you can certainly feel when it's there, and you can feel when it isn't. And oftentimes with like big films where it's like they're casting 2 A-listers to get the budget, let's say, and it's a romance film, a lot of the reviews would be like, well, they didn't have chemistry. And that was because they were cast for their names. Like, we wanted these 2 leads, regardless of how they work together. And we weren't going to be able to do that with this film. It had to work,
So are you saying that had you not found the right actors, you might have paused it or pulled the plug or tried to work on something else?
I think so, yeah. Because there's no there, as they say in film, you know what I mean? Like, it had to be there. So now we were trying very hard, though. I wasn't like doing it in the casual sense of like, well, if we don't find them. I was trying to find them. It was very difficult. And of course, because this film was at first self-financed and then Screen Ireland came on board, before Screen Ireland came on board, it's very difficult to work with like agencies. They're very hesitant, and I understand, why they are, because, they're effectively trying to guard their clients, let's say, from something that won't work out or that's not going to be useful for them. So they're
competing with projects that have money.
Exactly, and they're very skeptical about independent film, and I understand it. At the same time, sometimes you kind of think, well, is it not the job of an agent to discern which one is worth it and which one isn't? There's another element there. But I think a lot of them just have a general kind of just no, blanket no, because they're too skeptical of putting their client in something that doesn't work.
Yeah, there's actually an old story I read, and I don't know if it's true, but the story about James Woods was... Tarantino wanted James Woods for Reservoir Dogs, and Woods' agent didn't even show him it, didn't even tell him about it, and because at the time Woods was making like studio films and getting paid like much more than he would have, and the story goes, Woods then Reservoir Dogs comes out and is a sensation, and Woods gets wind of this and fires his agent. So the quality of the project and suitability of it, should definitely be a factor.
There are actually a lot of stories of directors meeting an actor after something coming out and saying, I actually approached your agent, and they're like, what? And then they fire them. It happens a lot, I think, and sometimes not even firing. I mean, even recently, apparently Michael Cera was annoyed that his agent didn't think he'd be interested in Barbie and didn't tell him about it initially, that Greta Gerwig wanted him in that film. So, like, it can happen at any level, you know, really, that an agent thinks he or she won't be interested in this.
You will not want to be in this critical darling that makes over $1 billion next. Once you found these actors, they're so wonderful in it. The chemistry is so great. I read that you workshopped it in the lead up to it. What did that consist of? How long did you spend on that?
So something I've been saying is that we were money poor but time rich. So it's like, well, we have 2 actors who I think are really good together, and it's their first feature and it's my first feature. And they obviously want it to go really well, as much as I do. So they're going to put the effort in, and we had time to prep. So a lot of time you don't have rehearsal time before a feature film. So I'm told, you know, it's like, it's hard to get people to schedule that. But with this, we would go to the location, one of the locations we were actually shooting in, which is the apartment set, which was it was an apartment that's due to some zoning issue. It's not being lived in at the moment. And so we were lucky enough to be able to just go in there and rehearse, right? And we would spend hours doing the scenes, and I would film them. And then we would talk about them after we shot them, you know, after we filmed them and rehearsed them. And so myself and Adam and Leah would talk about the scenes and say, like, well, how did you feel that went? Or is there anything that kind of bumps you? Or if I, you know, heard them say a line that hits the ear wrong, you know, I think it's a good idea as a writer to think, if something sounds wrong again and again, maybe it's something to do with the script and not, you know, the actor. You know, I think an actor, they're a great tool for that. They can tell you that something isn't working. And so we would maybe improv some stuff in that workshop that ended up in the script, you know, we would change things based off these rehearsal sessions and adapt them. And also, because it was written, you know, in a vacuum without actors, then I could tailor the script more to their specific tone and how they would play things and their sense of humor. Like, Leah's very funny and she's got a very specific, you know, sense of humor, and I felt like I could kind of play into that a bit throughout the workshopping of the script.
Nice. The way they talk is so natural. I don't know if you want to put a number on it, but how much did the script change between when you wrote it on your own and then after these workshops?
Yeah, I feel like the structure remained the same. The scenes remained the same, but certain, like, dialogue, certain lines of dialogue would change, you know. Sometimes it was only slightly, and sometimes it might be the entire line. I'd be like, that's actually a better way of saying that, you know. And something I would do on set when I'm shooting is I would shoot the scenes, the script kind of verbatim, a number of takes, and then when I thought we had that locked, I would say to them, I was like, well, let's do a loose take. Let's go a bit loose for a few takes and see if something else will come up. And sometimes they would end up in the final cut because, you know, you're trying to bring a spontaneity into scenes when they've been done again and again, you know, and you want, well, for this type of film, I wanted it to feel natural. I wanted those performances to feel very real. So that helps when you can allow them to just change it up on a certain take and try something different.
And then once they've nailed the written take, that would probably give them the confidence, and they'd be more relaxed knowing that even if the improv scene didn't work, they have the original in the can anyway. Would that be the case?
Yeah, it's like, let's just try something loose. It's just not as you know, we have to be so serious in this take. We can play around a bit, you know, it's playtime kind of thing.
And let's talk about influences. When I started watching it, I mean, no offense by this, it felt a bit Normal People-ish. The shadow of Trinity loomed large. And then when I saw the sports jacket with Trinity in the back, it reminded me of John Hughes, and it actually very like John Hughes in that it's about people trying to find their identity, find themselves. And then Rylane, which we mentioned before recording. There's parallels there, even though you had made it before you saw Rylane. And the umbrellas of Cherbourg, with the themes of mischances and the use of primary colours and people, I don't want to get into spoiler territory, but you never know when somebody will enter your life or return to your life. So can you speak to those influences?
Yeah, I mean, I love, as I said to you before we started, Umbrellas of Cherbourg is my favourite film, which is why I think my first real short when I was starting out was a musical. It was an Irish language musical called Bonsoir Luna, and I got some money from the Arts Council. I made this thing when I was like 23, and it's a overly ambitious short film, but I was so enamored with that film. That's why I think I made it. And I'm sure that influence has continued down the line towards this film. But sure, I mean, normal people, I'm sure the spectre does loom large in this piece because they're of a similar age as that story, and it's also very good. It's great. And there are a number of influences where I thought, like, a film like Cooper Raiff Shithouse, I'm not sure if you've seen that, where he, when he was 23, made this film for $15K on campus where he was a student, and it won at South by Southwest Best Film. And it is a similar thing about two people who meet at college and spend the night together. And I think I saw a film like that and I thought, yeah, I would be able to make this kind of film in Dublin. Like, I've always wanted to do it. And a film like Rylane is similar, which is like a London version of that, a film where two characters meet and spend the day together, So I think the influences in the film are manifold. I also was I'm a huge fan of John Hughes, so I'm glad you mentioned that. I definitely, when I was like 15, 16, I loved Breakfast Club and Some Kind of Wonderful, all those films. And I think even though those films, they're 80s films and that's a whole thing, the 80s aesthetic, I do think he captured something very real in those films that has remained timeless, that people still respond to, regardless of all the, maybe the songs, the kind of memes that are around the 80s at the moment. I think John Hughes' films still endure, And, of course, there's also maybe the shadow of the Linklaters Before trilogy in here too, which is, a very important, landmark trilogy in these kinds of films. So I think there is like a real hodgepodge in here.
But it has its own identity as well, of course. And it is, I would say, a pretty important Irish film in the history of trans cinema. So with that comes some responsibility. There's a lot to say about that. I guess, first of all, was it always your intention to make a trans film, or did you want to make this romantic drama and add a trans element to it?
No, it wasn't. It's not necessarily the intention so much as I had these two characters, like I said, that were inspired by people I had known and met and incidents in my own life. And I think when it came time to prep the film and make it, I was thinking, well, I need to have a dialogue with people from that community in the whole process. So, there were numerous like trans people on the team, as well as Leah, and also in the writing of it, I'd get feedback and we could talk. As like the workshopping process with Leah helped that, I think, a lot too, where I could just say to her, like, well, what do you think, about this? Or to another trans collaborator, I could say, like, what do you think about this scene? And we need to remember that no community is a monolith, because certain people had, different opinions on a scene. They thought like, oh, well, I wouldn't put that in. And then another trans artist will be like, no, I think you should put that in. And they'd have their specific reasons, And I think the film, there is a messiness to the characters that was very important to me. This idea that, like, I think all the characters in the film, and this is outside of Charlie and Jason, there is also her friend Alice and Mark, who's Jason's teammate. I think they all kind of oscillate between right and wrong at different points in the film. You know, they're all making mistakes, and you know, I thought it was interesting for people to see that and maybe argue after the film, but like, well, I didn't agree with how that character, you know, behaved. Like, I think he was in the wrong, or I think he was in the right, or however. Like, I definitely think that queer people respond to the film in a different way to straight audiences. From my so far from the festival screenings and from talking to different people and even seeing like the first reviews that come out on things like Letterboxd, I think there's a different response across the board, which I think is interesting. You know, it reminded me of, you know, when 500 Days of Summer came out, whenever that was. I then remember there was a real divide between men and women about that. Like, you know, she was wrong for leading him on, you know, or like men would say that, and then women would be like, she never said that's what she wanted, you know, he was wrong for, you know, inferring that. And I think those kind of dialogues after a film is useful for them to kind of live longer in the memory.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I really liked how Charlie was flawed. And it felt like a big departure from films like, say, Philadelphia. Like Philadelphia was a big landmark in queer cinema, but it was made for a mainstream audience, and the characters in that were kind of angelic. And I think it's really important for representation to show the spectrum, because it humanizes a community more, to show flaws, that they make mistakes just like we do, and when they're in their early 20s, they're trying to find themselves just like we do. And there's like cis and trans characters in that film who are still searching for the identity that fits them. So Charlie is trans, but people don't necessarily know when they meet. So I thought, for me, a theme of the film was a dilemma of, well, should she tell somebody she's interested in straight away or not?
Well, I would say that's one thing in the film that is certainly a reaction to other narratives I've seen in the past, trans narratives. That so Adam's character Jason, when he meets her at first, he doesn't realize, but then finds out immediately afterwards that she is, after first speaking with her, because I wanted to avoid this kind of, at this point, tired conflict of the twist in a film like the Crying Game, which I think Neil Jordan's one of our best filmmakers, and I actually quite like The Crying Game, but it is been done, you know, to death, this idea of the twist that someone is trans, and it's at this point played out. So we did discuss it, but in the writing mostly as well, I wrote different drafts, and I would grapple with that myself. But I remember early on in the writing process, I always wanted the audience to know from the beginning, and then the characters to know as quickly as possible as well, so that it didn't turn into that type of twist.
Yeah, that's very fair. And then, like, themes, of course, in it are universal, like the need to be seen and the need to be loved. So I assume those are themes that were there from the very start when you were doing the first draft.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what I really, I think, reckoned with in terms of the writing of the film is actually the structure, which I think is one of the most important things in writing, in screenwriting rather, is structure. So by which I mean, how long is this film going to be set over? How many days? Or, you know, because I initially thought, when I wrote the very first draft, it was set over a period of months. And then I went back and I was like, this film should be set over one day. And that was in the vein of all of these types of independent films, the Hallmarks, the Clerks, you know, Cleo from 5 to 7, whatever. All these films, a lot of them were set over the course of one day. So now the film a lot of it is set over the course of one day and night, but then there is also a section in the third act that's set over a number of weeks. So it wasn't in the end all set over one day. But that's what I found was one of the toughest things, is to figure out like how long, like how much time it should be set over. You know?
Yeah, because how quickly do the characters fall in love, and how long do they know each other before they reveal parts that they wouldn't in everyday life? It's a real dilemma, because it's really appealing in something like Before Sunrise that it's only like a night.
Yes.
Something like 12 hours.
Something like that. But then in the early, when it was also over one night, I remember someone being like, "This is the longest night ever." Someone in the reading, they were like, and I was like, "Yeah, it is a bit long, isn't it? Yeah, I'd be exhausted." So like, that's why it's not, the entire narrative isn't now longer like one night and day.
I know. Like, and the older I get, the more when I watch those overnight films, I'm like, man, I would just be conked out.
Yeah.
Like, I would have fallen asleep in the rickshaw. Like.
Yeah, actually, I'm just gonna go home. This film, film's over.
So I want to go a little deeper into the reaction. So you must be delighted with how it's being received so far.
I will say that the film certainly has surpassed my expectations. When my brother, Garrod, who's my producer, when I convinced him to do this, because I think a lot of your audience, they are creatives, and a lot of them are aspiring filmmakers, and when I've listened to episodes of this, I've been interested to hear like how people did this, you know. But I was a commercial video producer throughout my whole 20s, and my brother and I have a small company, and we would do that. A lot of sports video. I said to Garrod, I was like, I really want to make an independent film. Like, I do, not even that I wanted to make just a film that was fully financed, which obviously everyone wants, but I was kind of enamored with, you know, your Kevin Smiths in the 90s and Robert Rodriguez and all those people who did it. And
the mumblecore movement.
Joe Swanberg and all of them as well, and Greta Gerwig came out of that too. And particularly the Duplass brothers, which of course were in that movement too. And I said to my brother, I was like, well, we kind of came up with a plan that was, okay, we can self-finance this window of production. So we'll do that, and then we'll edit a rough draft. Then we'll send it to Screen Ireland and get completion funding. Then we'll get into something like the Galway Film Festival. Then we'll get distribution. Like, that's the lofty goal, right? So that was so each thing depended on the previous step working out. It was incredible risk. I don't know what I was thinking, actually, because once we shot the film, I was so confident, and then we shot the film, and we're going into the edit. And we wanted to submit a rough draft to Screen Ireland for completion funding, which, for those who don't know, is when Screen Ireland haven't been involved in a production, they can come in and give some money to the production to finish like post or whatever. But once we were in that stage, I was like, why did I actually think we'll get completion funding? Like, why was I so sure? Like, once it's very easy, all well and good saying, yeah, I'm going to do this, but then actually doing it, when you go through with it, is a totally different thing. I think, yeah, there was driven by a certain sense of maybe naivete. And then once we were in the edit, and I was getting more nervous, I was like, what if they say no? Like, the whole plan is done, right? So, you know, Garrod, my producer, he and I kind of swapped places because he was the skeptical one before. And then when we shot it and we were looking at the edit, he was like, I think it's pretty good. Like, he was like, I think they actually might give us the money. And I was like, Garrod, I'm so sorry that I dragged you into this. I was like, I don't know what I was thinking. Like, because it was both our finances from Gander that, you know, did the production window. I was like, I can't believe I did this. And then, so Screen Ireland came on board, which was unbelievable. And I was so surprised by it when they did. And we were very fortunate in that we got distribution before we went to festivals, because the real challenge for independent filmmakers and filmmakers who are fully financed is distribution. It's really that, because Breakout are a great company, and in particular a great domestic distributor. They really understand how to release films, Irish stories within the country, and it's why they've had successes with things like Uncalling Cune or So They May Face the Rising Sun. And when I met up with them, I was preparing to do one pickup shoot for the film after Screen Ireland came on board, small bits, and I was very busy, and then they wanted to meet, and I was like, well, they're probably going to meet up with me, and they're probably going to say, like, you know, oh, you know, we'd like to work with you in the future type of thing. And I sat down with them, and they were talking about how they wanted to come on board, and I was like, oh, this is a real meeting. I was like, I wasn't prepared at all. I was like, oh my God. So they came on board before we went to the festival route with Galway, and so it really was like a dream how that all worked out, because there are films that go to Galway that I don't have a distribution, and they need to get it afterwards. And that is just, it's so hard to get your film out there. That's really the challenge for independent filmmakers. And as I say, certain films that are fully financed is to get distribution. So we are just like kind of over the moon with Breakout and how they've handled this when they came on board with a really cool marketing campaign trying to target the right audience.
Yeah, and it must be so exciting that it's getting to cinemas, because I even read an interview, obviously a different style of director, but I was reading an interview about that Tom Hardy action movie Havoc, and the director was asked, would you like this to have gotten a cinema release? And he said, well, yes, but it's people are still going to see it, at least now that it's going straight to streaming and we got this budget. But so was part of you prepared for the possibility that it would just go straight to streaming? Are you delighted that it's going to be seen on the big screen?
Yeah, I mean, I did have that feeling, and there's other territories where things can go straight to streaming after they have a theatrical domestically. You know, that could happen. I think one thing about Ireland that we are, lucky about, and they always play that ad in the Lighthouse and elsewhere about how Ireland is the highest rated cinema goers per capita. We actually have a very loyal theater audience. Now, the challenge is, I don't know how many films that are in, let's say, the Ireland top 10 box office of the year. I don't know how many times Irish films enter into that top 10. Sometimes they do. There are certain films that, like I mentioned Colin Kuhn earlier, that did do very well, or even something like Small Things Like These. But the challenge really is for the Irish filmmaker to, I think, compete with international films, mostly American, because we do have a strong theater-going audience. But, I don't know if you've come across this. I feel like there is a lot. Certain people in Ireland are very, they actually don't want to go to see Irish films in theater, or they're very wary of them, And I'm not sure why that is. Perhaps they've been burned before, they think. But I think Irish cinema in the last few years has diversified across genre and different types to try and, bring loads of different types of films to the theater. I mean, Irish horror films, I don't think they're really being made before 2000s, really. Rawhead Rex.
Yes, Rawhead Rex. One of the stars of which lived around the corner from me when I was growing up. Yeah, which was a big thrill. But yeah, you're right. We're only doing rom-coms and thrillers and stuff like that relatively recently. And I think that some audience members think that dramas aren't as cinematic as, say, I don't know, a Marvel movie or something, but something like on Colin Kuhn or your film are cinematic.
It's interesting though, because the box office hits, the domestic box office hits in Ireland are nearly always drama. They have been Colin Kuhn, So They May Face the Rising Sun, Small Things Like These, which are quite measured. Even some might call them slow cinema. But those films are the ones that have done really well, domestically. It's strange, Yeah.
But they're kind of Terrence Malickian, and Malick is so cinematic.
Yes.
Did the reaction to the film so far differ from what you expected?
Well, I was always just interested to see what the reaction would be. That's really what I was curious about, because, as you know, when you're making a film, it's in a vacuum for so long that you really don't know what people will make of it. And I think this film as well, because it has a queer element, and there's going to be people who watch it from the queer community and then other communities as well, they're going to have different response to it. But so far, the gays screening in the Lighthouse and Galway Film Flat, they were very positive, and I was able to talk to different people about how they felt about it. And some people wanted, one person who was gave me very interesting feedback of how he liked that there was a before sunrise kind of element to it, and he wished it was just that. And I can understand that, because the film takes some maybe narrative swings halfway through, and it brings a lot more conflict into it, which I was always very interested in from a writing perspective. And when the film comes out, that's another thing I'm most interested in, is how the second half of the film will play to audiences, because, there is a version of this film that is more kind of laid back for its entire runtime and doesn't have the conflict that comes in really around the halfway point of the film, and I can see an argument for that. But for me, I guess it was just more interesting to do something like A Left Turn that was, maybe a bit darker in some ways,
Yeah, Yeah, some people don't like being surprised when they go to a film.
I don't understand that at all. It's kind of all I want at this point, you know. I suppose because I've seen so many films in my life, what I want when I'm in a theater is to not know where a film is going. That's what I really want.
Yeah, they're my favorite film experiences, like especially in cinema of last, I don't know, 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
Is when I've been surprised. That's why, when I bring my young daughter to cinema, I envy her for not having seen like 1,000 sports movies. So when she goes to see Formula One, she's like, "Oh my God, are they going to win the big race?" Like it's really nice for her. But you can still get that experience. Since this is an industry podcast as well as one for general audiences, people would be very interested to know about making the leap from not making films to making films. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I definitely spent a lot of my 20s thinking about it. And I will say about this podcast, there's an episode of this podcast a few years back. I think Paul conducted the interview with Lenny after Normal People came out. It just came out. And I was listening to him. It's during COVID. I was listening to Lenny Abramson talking about approaching that, how to get into making your first films. And he just talked about how you really shouldn't go into it like, no half measures. And I felt maybe that I had done that in the past. And if I was going to make that leap, I'd have to just take it very, very, very seriously, how to do it. Because I'd spent my 20s thinking about how to make a feature film, a debut feature film. I thought about it a lot, and that's why, earlier we talked about doing horror shorts and how I ended up making this kind of film instead as my debut. I think that happened because of just all of this, like, ruminating on it for so long, being like, what would be the right way to make a film? So throughout my 20s, I was doing a lot of sports videography, working with different companies, myself and my brother, and I was making shorts. And I think, like everyone, I'd been shortlisted for about every grant in the country, for every short film grant. We've all been there. And, I looked at that way in, that kind of typical way to get a film made in Ireland of you go to IDT, which I didn't do, and you get a thesis film made, you go on the festival route, you start crewing up, start applying to these grants, shooting music videos, get some good festival press with your shorts, maybe try and curtail that into working a bit in TV or getting more shorts funded. But overall, the process can take, 15 years maybe to get your first feature made, something like that. And I just couldn't feel like I'm not sure if my shorts were good enough, because I feel like I'm very comfortable working in feature films, but I don't know if my shorts really were indicative of what I could do. And they're quite different as well from Girls and Boys in some ways, as you mentioned earlier. Like 2 of them are horror films. And I didn't feel like someone was going to finance me off the back of the shorts, and the other work, which is, I was working sometimes in TV. I was doing ads with, some of these companies with Boyle Sports and Paddy Power. And I just didn't think someone would look from one of the funding bodies and think, this guy, I think let's finance his first feature based off what I'd done, which is why I kept thinking about the independent route and then maybe getting completion funding afterwards. Because I had so much experience shooting. So shooting, ads and commercial stuff as well as the shorts. I kind of knew how you could shoot a production window on a tight budget. Now, the rest of it, like post-production and everything that entails, that's totally different. Like, but for the actual production window, I was like, I set a budget. And I was like, the budget is a state of mind. That's what Guillermo del Toro said when he made The Shape of Water, because it was much smaller than his other films. He's like, you just got to put yourself in that state of mind and just stay within the parameters of it. And the script was also written with that in mind. You have to write the script to that confines, which is another reason why a genre piece, I didn't want to do one. Because for me, I just feel like there are great examples of, low budget genre films, but a lot of them are kind of playing with that low budget element, like your Blair Witch or Paranormal Activity. It's quite hard to do one, on a small budget unless you're leaning into it, But I thought with a drama, it just makes more sense. Like, it's just not going to stretch the budget as much if you just set that goal of like, well, I'm not going to have very much VFX. You know, there are some in the film, but not too many. I'm not going to have very much VFX or action beats, or things like that are hard to accomplish on that budget. So you put yourself in that mindset of, I'm making an independent film on a certain budget, and everything serves that purpose. So the script, the shooting, you know, the setting. Like, for example, if you're shooting a film all in Dublin, when you kind of agree, like, I'm just going to work with people who live in Dublin. I'm not going to be paying hotels. We're not traveling, you know. We're not going somewhere else in Ireland, which can bring up costs very, you know, like straight away once you bring in travel to it. And even though I don't really agree with that whole idea that a feature film, an independent feature film, should be one location, you know, that so many of them, right? And there are some good ones, but they're tough to do. I kind of thought, well, it's more about company moves. What's really hard is company moves in a given day. So we just didn't do that. We did one. But what we mostly did was we would stay in the location for the whole day that we were shooting in. And sometimes that location, we'd be using that for 3 days in a row, or sometimes we're using that location just that one day. But if you just avoid company moves and you're shooting all within the same city, you don't have to make a one location film, you know, if you don't want to. You just kind of have to be a bit light on your feet with the production, and, you know, the crew needs to be small enough, you know, so you can do that.
Yeah, a nimble production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I imagine. From talking to you and also other filmmakers, it seems that you need a mix of naivete and being a bit of a dreamer combined with practicality, because you want to be realistic, but also a little unrealistic. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because so many filmmakers, they come out of college or school and they're so ambitious and driven, and they think, I want to make a feature now. But, like, I mean, if I had made a feature at that age, it probably wouldn't really bad. Like, I don't know. Like, it's probably good it didn't happen. But at the same time, I still wanted to make a feature film when I was relatively young, because I knew I wanted to make this one about young people. And so I wanted to be able to do it with, you know, I'm older than most of the people in the cast when it's about, but only by a few years. Whereas, you know, I think if you are playing that game, the waiting game, often you don't make your first feature till you're older. And I just kind of thought that would be a bit sad. I wanted to do it earlier. I wanted to do it while I had energy. And I was like, I want to make a film, like, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, also you're the same generation as the actors.
Yeah.
Whereas a generation is 25 years. So that would, if you'd waited another 10 or 15 years, you would be a completely removed generation from, like, the college student character.
Yeah, and it's in the writing of it, that's important too, to be within kind of the same, like, ballpark, generally speaking. You know, you want an authenticity there, you know.
Yeah, you don't want to be saying cowabunga or other 90s phrases, like the kids, putting those into the kids.
Yeah.
A very common question we have on this podcast is dealing with rejection and your path. So how have you dealt with that, or how do you deal with it?
Man, I really wish they'd talked about that more in college. I do not think I was prepared for that at all. Like, when I was in my 20s, as I said, leaving college to submit to these grants and stuff. And I think, well, I did film in Trinity, which is a mix of kind of theoretical and practical. And when I mentioned my short film, Bonsoir Luna, right, which I got financing for from the Arts Council at the end of, literally, when I was still in college, to do right after I finished, right? And so I got a grant to make another film, a Trinity alumni grant, and then I got a grant to make Bonsoir Luna. So I got the first two grants I ever applied for. Got them within the space of a few months. And I was like, this is easy. I was like, this is what I thought. Yeah, all right. And then I didn't get financing again for 10 years. Wow. That's not happened. So, because in the interim of those two grants, I got shortlisted for loads of stuff. And, you know, I think at times, I don't know, I don't think I dealt with it very well. Because it's, when you're younger, I do think it's very hard to contextualize, you know, age and how long things take. You know, it just seems so long, you know, to wait years to make a film. And I think, like, if I was going back in time and I met myself graduating college at 22, okay, 22, 23, and I said, you're going to make your first film in 10 years, I think you'd be devastated. Because they just couldn't understand that, like, the
feels
path.
like forever.
Yeah, it feels like forever. And I think there was one grant that I was like sure I was going to get for a short film. It was a good budget, and I was on my way to Amsterdam for a birthday thing, and I got the rejection on the plane, waiting to get on the plane. And I just went to Amsterdam and just drank like a lot, really sad. Like, it was really like just so upset about it. Like, so I think the world, I dealt with it in every kind of different way, you know, with positivity and in negativity, and, you know, every which way you can deal with it. But I think the most important thing, and I believe, again, Lenny said it on this podcast when he was here, was about bitterness. Like, if you became very bitter about it as you kept going, it would ultimately bring you down. You know, I think like making a film at the end of the day is like, it's a huge endeavor. And I was probably like right. They were probably right to say no to me back then. I can see that now. And, you know, some of the times I would see the films that got picked afterwards and I was like, that was pretty good. You know, it's like, good for them, you know, like, but at the time I found it hard to deal with that. But yeah, I think once you allow it to bring you down and just kind of wallow in it, it's the end, basically. Because like Girls and Boys it had to be made out of positivity, you know, even though there was a lot stacked against me when I went into making this film. As I said, people didn't want to talk to me, like, and I understand this, like, totally why. Like, as I said, maybe agencies were one thing, but just other, you know, creatives as well, when they kind of hear saying, oh, you're making, you know what I mean? People who might have been like in key creative roles. Now, I got a great team in the end, so it was brilliant. But I definitely dealt with some people who are just like, and I totally understand why they wouldn't want to do it, because you're working on, you know, very well paid shoots, or that are properly financed. So why would you take that risk with something like this? So I wouldn't blame them for it. But like, I had to, over years, build up that skin of being rejected. And also shouted at, I feel like, by like people, like at like, because you know when you're shooting a film, people give out to you a lot, like on locations, if you're there and you've got permission to be there, but someone didn't tell the owner of that place, you know, and they'll go mad that you, like, you don't have to build up all these rejections, or just people from the public come up and give out that you took a parking space and start shouting at you. There's loads of like things that you have to really be like, like build up a very thick skin.
That's a great answer. And just finally, what have you seen recently, Irish or otherwise, that has really impressed you?
Yeah, I really did like Small Things Like These, actually, because I found that it didn't lean into maybe the misery potential of that story, which is a very dark subject matter. And it's a great book, anyway, by Claire Keegan. But I felt like it was actually somewhat hopeful, even though it was dealing with a very dark subject material, and it really captured that feel of an older Ireland, like it's kind of gone now, maybe a bit, you know, like I think it's set in the 80s, and I really liked that film. And in a similar vein, like on Colin Kuhn with Breakout, which I also just thought it's something that we do very well in Ireland, actually, this kind of very simple observational cinema. And then I also saw Christie, which was at Galway with us, which I really enjoyed that too. I feel like looking at the slate now, films that are coming out in Ireland, as I said earlier, there is a more diverse slate of types of films that are coming out. You know, I see different, like people are swinging for different types of things, which I'm really glad about, because I think it changed. The film landscape changed a lot from when I started college when I was 18, like say, like 2010. It changed dramatically from then to now. You know, I don't think the kinds of films that are coming out now, I don't think we were getting as many of them back then. And that can be anything from, like I mentioned, you know, Damien McCarthy and Oddity, to Small Things Like These. It's just a very, you know, they have diversified what they're looking for in the funding bodies, which I think is great, because it'll make us a major player, hopefully, on the world stage, because Ireland's become so, you know, popular for a shooting destination. But oftentimes that can just mean people using the resources in Ireland, but they're not actually making Irish stories. So it's good for the the body of film in Ireland. It's good for the crews and the experience, but we also need to be making domestic stories that can play here, but also internationally. Like, I do hope that, I think Girls and Boys there's a universality there. I think the film could work well in North America, you know?
For sure.
And I've been getting messages from people from North America a lot, asking me if they can see it, mostly from young queer people I think really interested in seeing when they've seen the trailer, and so we hope to get distribution there as well.
Yeah, I think paradoxically, the more personal a film is, the more universal it becomes.
Yeah, for sure. Like, we've seen it before at our cinema with things like Once that blow up abroad, you know, like, and it's almost surprising. I don't think anyone would have assumed that that was going to do that, you know, but it did. It became a phenomenon.
Yeah, great example. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming in to us.
Thanks, Joe.
It was
Absolutely.
a lovely film.
Thank you so much.
And congratulations on it. I really look forward to seeing what you're doing next. Oh, I meant to ask you, what are you doing next? Is it too soon to say?
Well, I have a script that I'm going to bring out and try and get financed. So here it starts all over again. You know, that's the tough thing. It's like, oh man, like, I also want to say as well, in terms of just actually a quick thing, in terms of it being, you know, this kind of podcast and maybe the people who listen to it, I'm under no illusion that it would be easy to get another film made now, just because Girls and Boys is coming out, and it's coming out, and that's great. But I think every time you try to make a film, it's an uphill battle. Like, it's not going to be, you know, now like, the doors are open, like, come on in, that you've joined the club. No, it's not going to work that way. It's unfortunately going to be tough again. And I do have a film I want to make as my next film, and I hope that Girls and Boys will make that easier. But I still think it'll be a challenge.
Okay, that's fair. Because I ended up asking an extra question at the end, thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks, Joe.